Today is 4th of November, and this is Glendale Water and Power Commission meeting. Madam Secretary, would you please do the roll call?
President Avanesian.
Present.
Commissioner Carrasco.
Here.
Commissioner Kadikian.
Here.
Commissioner Lott.
Present.
Next item, please.
2A, approval of the minutes for the October 7, 2019 meeting.
Is there any comments?
No, I'd like to move to approve the minutes.
I second.
Okay. Next item.
3, GWP Commission staff comments.
Any comment?
I'll comment that unfortunately we have lost Commissioner Watson. He's literally moved on to warmer and warmer climate and better things. He's greener pastures. So I don't know what the status is. Maybe staff can tell us, is there already a nomination present for another commissioner, or if not, has a nomination been made? Or
Commissioner Lowell, I don't believe a nomination has been made, but I know that Mr. Zern is working on getting someone as quickly as he can to fill the spot.
So in that vein, I would just encourage any member of the public here in Glendale who meets the eligibility requirements to please consider applying for this commission opening. Commissions are an incredibly important part of the running of the city. And as a commissioner, I hope that I've been able to make a contribution for the betterment of the city, as well as having the opportunity to learn so much about how the city is run. So it's really just a very rewarding thing to do. And it's very important that our city commissions reflect the diversity of our city. We have an incredibly diverse city. And so I would just encourage everyone, but especially people who maybe don't think of themselves as potential commissioners, you are. So please, if this is an area that interests you, please come forward and apply for this commission or any other commission opening that interests you.
Thank you. Next item.
4, actions. 4A, GWP Commission elections. Secretary.
Mr. President and members of the Commission, we have on the agenda today the election of a Commission Secretary. We have this a little bit out of step with the President election due to the fact that last year we had nominated Mr. Hale as the President of the Commission, and then unfortunately he had to resign, and we then elected you, President Avanesian. My suggestion to you for your consideration would be to continue this to next month so that we could also agendize the nomination of a president. I think it might be a little bit easier and more seamless if you had the elections on the same evening, but that's entirely within your prerogative if you prefer to proceed.
That sounds reasonable. Do you have any?
I would agree that kind of makes sense to take that path.
I would agree as well. And if everybody's in agreement, I'll make the motion to move it so.
I would second that. I think it makes sense to have them concurrent.
Okay.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you.
5 reports. 5A, legislative update.
Good afternoon. My name is Leo Zayan with Glendale Water and Power, legislative analyst, here to provide you with the legislative update. So we have been attending many meetings in Los Angeles and Sacramento, and we've been at the forefront of legislative affairs. We've been actively participating in this effort alongside with CMUA and SCAPA members. So I'm going to go over a few key bills in water and also in energy. At the same time, I'm going to recap the 2019 legislative session and also what bills to expect in 2020. Okay. Good? Okay. There you go. So 2019 legislative calendar overview. So October 13 was the last day for the governor to sign and veto bills. And January 1st is any bills that were, most bills that were signed into law will take effect. And January 6th is the next legislative session that reconvenes. So 2019 legislative highlights. So there were 1,042 bills sent to the governor. And out of those, 870 were signed and 172 were vetoed. Some of the major legislative actions that were taken by the state, of course, wildfires, AB 1054, and we'll have a presentation following mine. Human right to water, SB 200, that was passed. And also one major legislation, the rollback standards from Trump, which was the Trump insurance, SB 1, was actually vetoed by the governor this time around. So some key energy bills, we have AB 1208 by Assemblymember Ting. This is the UUT exemption on residential solar production. This was chapters, meaning that was signed and it's law now. AB 1424, this is the EV charging stations to integrate additional payment options. This became a 2-year bill, so this will come back in the next legislative session. SB 457, this is to promote biomethane procurement in the state. So this was also chaptered. And SB 560, this is additional requirement for de-energization to have in our wildfire mitigation plans. This was also signed by the governor. And last but not least, SB 676, this is a study on integration of EVs in our electric grid. This was also signed by the governor.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
May you please explain what it means, chaptered?
Chapters means that it was signed by the governor, now it's law. Yeah.
When is it going to take effect, these ones?
So most statutes take effect January 1st, 2020.
That's sort of the default.
Yeah.
Default, unless otherwise stated in the bill.
Yeah. Do we know the impact, at least the utility users tax is going to have on Glendale?
So that bill, so what that does is it excludes taxes on solar.
Right.
So we have done some analysis in-house to see what that's extending 7 additional years.
Mm-hmm.
So any resident that also produces solar, we're not going to increase or decrease the utility users tax. So it's still going to be no tax on solar production.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah. So a few water bills, AB 1180. This is by Assemblymember Friedman. This adopted by, backflow protection measures. This was also signed by the governor. AB 1414. This is streamlining water reporting deadlines. This was also signed by the governor. And SB 134. This is to meet some performance standards for water loss. This was also signed by the governor. And last but not least, SB 414. This is consolidation of non-compliant water system. This became actually a 2-year bill, so this was not passed. It'll come back in the next legislative session. Next, some potential 2020 bills that will come up in the next legislative session.
Excuse me, I'm
yes,
interrupting you. So can you please explain what does this backflow protection mean?
Sure. So what that means is they're going to have a backflow protection device on the customer side, so it protects the water kind of that coming in from the metered side to the residential side. It's just a device that's going to be put.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. Is that it? Why is it? The mouse is not working today. It's working backwards.
There it is.
Okay. Next, we have some potential bills in terms of water. We have some water resiliency portfolio. This means that they're going to talk about the delta tunnels and also other resources on water. Water quality measures in terms of doing, as you may have heard in the news, there are a lot of water contaminants that people talk about, so they're going to most likely have some kind of legislation on that. And then wildfire preparedness, making sure, for example, if a big company de-energizes, the water companies are ready to act. And then next we have energy. In terms of energy, we have wildfire issues. As you know, this is still a relevant topic in the state legislature. We might have issues or legislation and procurement mandates. and also microgrids and DERs, and of course, last but not least, transportation electrification. So those are some of the potential topic bills that will come in the next legislative session. And then, I think that's it. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
With regards to the upcoming energy potential bill topics, the microgrids and the transportation electrification, that's something which pretty much would interest us a lot, very much on this commission. Could we get a more detailed report later on, maybe at some point, to understand what kind of bills are upcoming and what kind of input we're going to give, if any, just so that we get some involvement in this? These are issues which affect us, especially in Glendale, given what we went through with Grayson and all that kind of stuff.
Of course, those are the bills that topics. We don't have the bills yet. The legislature is working on it. As bills come forward, we'll bring it to commission for review.
Also, I would like you to explain a little bit what is this wildfire issues mean? I mean, are we prepared for any kind of fire? And
We are. The next presentation after me is going to be talking about our wildfire mitigation plan. On this slide, what I mean is they're going to be, the legislature is looking at other issues in terms of wildfire, what it can do to contain and mitigate all the risks that have to do with wildfires. So that's a constant issue that state is always looking at. And all the utilities are mandated to have a wildfire mitigation plan, which Daryl Hahn will talk about it more after my presentation.
thank you.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Next, please.
5B, presentation of draft wildfire mitigation plan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, President Albanesian, Commission members. My name is Doreen Martirosyan. Daryl and I are going to give you a presentation of the wildfire mitigation plan. If you recall, we were before you on September 5th, and we presented the plan. It was in the early stages. We've made great progress, and we'll go through the steps of what has been done and what needs to be done and what's mandated. When we were before you in September, we discussed the wildfires and how they've been getting worse and more destructive. Unfortunately, we've been seeing what has been going on around us on TV, on the news. It's almost daily that we're getting news of a new wildfire. They're being destructive. So utilities are being held responsible even when they're not negligent. This is under the doctrine of strict liability. If you remember, we also discussed the latest California Supreme Court ruling in the city of Oroville. It was the first ruling in 20 years. This was the case where it was a dental practice in the city of Oroville. What happened is they had raw sewage back up into their dental practice, and they sued the city. So they went through the court system, and the Supreme Court of California basically held that the city was not liable for inverse condemnation because the city had mandates and ordinances for all businesses comparable to the dental practice to install a backflow prevention device. So the dental practice had not had one installed, and the court held that had that device been installed, it would have mitigated the damage. That was good news. We all got excited. All the utilities are excited because the takeaway is that if the cities and the utilities do what they need to do to have plans, mitigation measures, rules, regulations, and ordinances, then that takes away the level of liability from the city. When a wildfire occurs, the courts will look to see, was the city really negligent? Or did the city act in a reasonable manner to do everything or to mandate everything possible to prohibit such fires or the damage? We also talked about the different bills that have been signed into law. We talked about Senate Bill 1028, which requires the utilities to conduct survey of their lines and equipment to make sure that they don't pose a significant risk to cause a catastrophic fire. There's Senate Bill 901, which is the law that mandates the city of Glendale and all other public electric utilities to come up with a wildfire mitigation plan. And the plan is what we presented to you in September and what Daryl's going to talk more about today. We are continuously taking commission input, public input, if the public has questions, comments, of course, comments from the commissioners. And the plan is going to be presented to the City Council in December. We have the date of December 3rd in the slide. We're aiming for that, but it may be on a later date, but definitely in the month of December, because the plan has to be adopted by the governing board by the end of the year. There's Assembly Bill 111, which establishes the CPUC, California Public Utilities Commission, the Wildfire Safety Division. They get to look at the wildfire management plans. They may get to make comments, and the utilities are mandated to submit their plans to the board no later than July 1st of 2020, and then thereafter each year. So what we have done thus far, we were before the GWP Commission on September 5th. We have drafted the wildfire mitigation plan. We have submitted the draft plan to a third party for independent review. That's mandated by SB 901, that each utility has to retain a third party evaluator, a consultant, to look at the plan, make comments, tell us if it's good enough, where we can make it stronger, where we can make changes. So that is going to be completed by the end of November, and we are here to solicit your input, your comments. Of course, we will share that with our independent evaluator, and we will take the plan to the City Council. Again, we have the date of December 3rd. That date may change to a later date in December, but it's definitely going to be in the month of December. It has to be adopted before January 1 of 2020. Thereafter, we're going to do public outreach, education about the plan. Of course, when we take the plan to the City Council, the public is more than welcome to make comments on the plan, to ask questions if they have any. And then we submit the plan to the Wildfire Safety Advisory Board, and we receive their feedback. I'm happy to say that the plan that we've been working on is pretty robust, but I'm going to let Daryl take over and talk about the details of the plan. Do you want to switch seats? No. You good? Sure. Okay.
Thank you, Doreen. Mr. President, members of the Commission, my name is Daryl Hahn. I am the Electrical Services Administrator, overseeing GWP's electric engineering function. As Doreen mentioned a few minutes ago, I will be walking you through some of the highlights of our wildfire mitigation plan. At this point, it's still in draft form, and it's about 40 pages long, so I don't want to bore you by doing a page turn, but I can walk you through some of the highlights and touch on some of the same topics that we discussed in September. So, at a very high level, the intent of the wildfire mitigation plan is to minimize catastrophic wildfires. In order to do that, we need to define what is a catastrophic wildfire. I think we all have in our minds an idea of what that means, so we set about trying to put our hands around what a catastrophic wildfire is. As you can see on the slide, this catastrophic wildfire initiates from an unplanned ignition, so we're not talking about fires necessarily that were set on purpose. They are free burning, out of control, typically vegetative in nature. They're highly destructive. They're large, generally more than 300 acres in size, and the objective at this point is full suppression of the fire. And so we can break a wildfire down into two key elements. One is the ignition source for the wildfire, and one is the ability to spread. So you need both of these elements in order to have what we call a wildfire. You remove one or both of these elements, you no longer have a wildfire. Next slide. So at this point, the City of Glendale has a fair amount of mitigation against wildfires in place already. So as we mentioned in September, the fire department has what they call their Vegetation Management Program, the VMP. And what this aims to do is to localize fires when they do start. So let's say a house catches on fire. The intent of the VMP is to keep that fire from spreading to other properties, so to localize that fire. And this is a fairly robust robust program that requires homeowners to keep brush and flammable vegetation clear of the home. You probably are aware of this program. And so coupling this with this requirement, what we're seeing is that rather than seeing that 62% of the city is at high or extreme wildfire danger, we can really reduce our focus to less than 0.5% of the city. So what this means is Glendale Water and Power does not need to focus on mitigating wildfire across 62% of the city, but really just in fairly targeted, narrow parts of the city. And so we do this primarily through primarily through engineering, constructing, maintaining, and operating the system to minimize the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So we have several mitigating measures in place today. First, Glendale Water and Power and Public Works both have tree trimming contracts in place. As you probably know, contact with vegetation is the leading cause of wildfires that are sparked by electric utilities. And so the simple answer is to trim trees. If the trees can't touch the wires, then they're less likely to start fires. So that's one of the main reasons we have these tree trimming contracts in place. During high wildfire danger periods, especially during red flag warnings, we will disable the devices that automatically reclose. So we have these protective devices on our electric lines, and anytime they detect something out of the ordinary, typically a tree touching a line or a squirrel or a bird or something like that, they will automatically reopen for, say, 10 seconds. And it assumes that whatever caused the contact has cleared, and it will automatically reclose, meaning it'll re-energize the customers. But during periods of high wildfire danger, we don't want to automatically reclose because we could accidentally start a fire. And so we disable that functionality during periods of extreme wildfire danger. We also require a visual inspection before re-energizing a circuit. So let's say during a high wildfire period, and a circuit de-energizes as it's supposed to do, rather than just automatically reclosing it or a couple of minutes later reclosing it, we will physically patrol the circuit to make sure that there are no trees on the lines and that there is no danger of sparking a fire. And lastly, we also reserve the right to preemptively disable or de-energize customers. At this point, we do not have plans to do this, but it's always something that, from an operational perspective, is something that we reserve the right to do. So that's what we have in place today. Now, going forward, we have a lot of options on the engineering side in terms of mitigating wildfires. So one of the options is what we call covered tree wire. So again, with vegetation contacts being one of the leading causes of wildfires, if we cover the wire, obviously you minimize the ability to start fires that way. So that's something that we're looking into in certain areas. Another option is to implement additional automated protection schemes. So one of our options is something called the falling conductor protection scheme. So what this does is these schemes will actually detect when there's a conductor that's broken or become dislodged and is falling, and before it actually hits the ground in 1.5 to 2 seconds, it will de-energize the line. So when the conductor hits the ground, it doesn't create sparks. So we're looking into that as a potential option. Another option is to move the equipment underground. This is a very costly option, and it's not always a feasible option, but it is one of the options that we have in our pocket. The fourth potential future solution is more frequent inspections. The intent here is to replace aging equipment. Obviously, as equipment ages, it becomes more prone to damage and more likely to fail and cause wildfires. Finally, there are technologies that will allow us to convert to so-called no-spark fuses. So on our distribution lines, we have fuses that will automatically burn and de-energize a line. The problem is when they burn, they create a spark and can cause a fire, especially if there's undergrowth and so forth. They make a special type of fuse that's very expensive, but it does not spark. So this is just to give you an idea that there are a lot of technologies out there already in place that are proven that we can implement in specific areas of our system. Depending on the specifics at each area, we will choose a different solution to mitigate wildfire. So that's really based on engineering studies. So that concludes my prepared slides. Absolutely.
Thank you for that technical explanation. It makes all sense, whatever you said. But one thing I want to ask is about this preemptive, measures. As we know, both Edison and other utilities, they have a measure where to turn off the lines or transformers. So before anything happening, like whatever you said, do we have any criteria like temperature, wind, situation that we know that this is going to happen? So it's better to turn off before anything happening. Do you have you thought about that sort of measure?
Sure. President Avanesian, members of the commission, that's a really good question. We do monitor the weather, and we look at the red flag warning, which is an official decree of high wildfire danger. And when that happens, we do take some of those measures that I mentioned earlier, disabling the reclosers and so forth. There is at least one transmission line within the city that we will de-energize during these red flag warning periods. That does not de-energize any customers, so no customers actually lose power. It just makes our system, puts it in a different state so that we're less likely to start fires, especially in some of the mountainous areas that are more difficult to reach. At this time, we do not have any plans to de-energize any customers. That's not our intent. We are a little bit different from Edison and PG&E and even LADWP in that we have a significantly smaller service territory, and we work very closely with our fire department. And so in general, where our electric utilities are located, the fire department has a history, has a record of being and responding within 5 minutes. And so the idea is we don't have the long and remote assets that some of these other utilities have that are much larger. They cover tens of thousands of square miles. So in our case, we don't de-energize customers. That said, there are always some operational conditions such that our system dispatchers will reserve the right to de-energize customers. But at this point, we do not have a plan to do so.
Thank you. What about if we have different alternatives to feed an area, to choose alternative that the route or the danger of fire is less? Do we have that sort of alternatives to play with the switching of the lines and choose the ones that the path is less likely to have fire around there?
Sure. President Avanesian, members of the commission, regardless of how the energy is fed to the customers have to have electricity at their homes. So whether the electricity is sourced, let's say, upstream or downstream or from this end of the street or that end of the street, at the end of the day, it all comes to the customer. So while we do have flexibility in terms of how we can feed the customers, in general, that does not really play into the wildfire danger.
Thank you.
I have just general education information for myself. A lot of these technologies seem, at least to us in California, something new because all these fires and all these requirements are new. Are there other territories, countries, states who have dealt with these issues, and who would you say would be one of those leading early adopters that we could look up to and kind of learn from them instead of reinventing the whole wheel from the beginning?
Sure. So I have Commissioner Kadikian, I have a couple of examples that I can give you. One, actually here in California, San Diego Gas and Electric has been at the forefront of a lot of the wildfire mitigating efforts. And so while technologies that I mentioned are relatively new to Glendale Water and Power, they are not new to the industry and not new to California. So we can look at San Diego as an example for how to roll out some of these technologies and what type of technologies we can look at. There's also a lot of great work being done, in fact, down in Australia. So we've been looking to some of the lessons learned in Australia and some of the technologies that they've been implementing as well. So the good news for us is that we're not leading edge or bleeding edge, and we're able to learn from some of these other utilities in terms of best practices and what works and what doesn't work.
Thank you.
I have a question. You mentioned the undergrounding of the lines. Is that even feasible given the topography here in Glendale and in the canyon and mountain areas?
Sure. Commissioner Crosco, the answer is it depends. You're absolutely right. In some areas, it is just not feasible to bury the lines. It's very rocky, it's very remote, it can get quite expensive. But in other areas, in fact, we underground today. So it really just depends on the area, the topography, and one of the things that we will be looking at is what's the most cost-effective way to mitigate wildfire. So, of course, putting something underground seems like a panacea, seems like the perfect answer. In some cases, it might be very expensive, and you do have some drawbacks from undergrounding these assets. For example, if an underground cable fails, you can't just look up in the sky and see where it's failed. It's buried somewhere in a conduit, and so it takes longer to find and fix and restore customers. The underground cables also don't last as long, typically, compared to overhead conductors. And so, again, it's not the perfect answer, but it is, in many cases, the right answer to mitigate against wildfire.
And as a follow-up, when we say expensive, that means ultimately it will hit the rates?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Are there countries or other areas of the United States that are widely adopting undergrounding of electrical wires?
Commissioner Law, we can look just a few miles east to our friends in Pasadena. They have implemented an undergrounding program. I believe they are 4 years into their 400-year program to underground all assets in their city. So that's an example.
Okay, just to make sure I understood that, because I didn't have my coffee this afternoon. You just said 4 years into a 400-year program?
Yes, that's right.
Okay,
There's a lot of cables to bring down.
apparently. What are they up to in Pasadena, my goodness?
I want to add that sometimes, I mean, if you have underground transformer, maybe it is more dangerous during the floods. You know, water goes there, and you have other problems, you know. So all the time, you know, undergrounding is not going to help that much.
Yeah, I guess my question would have been, I mean, not only are we having this severe wildfire season, these very severe wildfire seasons, extreme heat, we're also then, when it rains, we're getting, you know, catastrophic flooding. And we are also in a very seismically active area. And so my question would be, in terms of undergrounding, how does that, when you do the cost-benefit analysis on that in terms of safety and reliability, where does it come out when you think of our areas, you know, being earthquake-prone?
Sure. President Avanesi and Commissioner Law, absolutely. Anytime you look at undergrounding a section of electrical assets, there's always the pro and con lists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're absolutely right. Undergrounding assets can put them in an elevated state of concern for earthquakes and flooding. But at the same time, you also mitigate some of these other issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really just a matter of trying to decide where you want to mitigate your risk and which is the better option. You know, when it comes to earthquakes and flooding, again, we're not inventing the wheel here, so we can leverage existing technologies. For example, we do have a lot of assets that are underground, and those have not been an issue in recent memory, at least. The conduits, for example, are not as rigid such that they might be a huge concern in a quote-unquote normal earthquake. Now, in a major earthquake, of course, all bets are off. But so there are technologies out there that would accommodate some of the concerns that you've talked about.
Thank you very much.
I've got one more question. I just wanted to make sure I understood the current mitigation efforts. You said that the exposure would be 62% were it not for the city's ongoing mitigation efforts, which bring it down to roughly 0.5%.
Right.
So does that mean 62% of the residents? Does it mean 62% of the customers? Does it mean 62% of the landmass? What is that 62%?
Sure. Commissioner Law, members of the commission, that's a good question. The 62% actually refers to land area within the city,
Okay.
and that's based on maps that are developed by the CPUC in conjunction with CAL FIRE to assign a level of wildfire danger geographically to all areas in the state of California.
Okay, and so the mitigation efforts are the vegetation management plan, which is something that is put into practice through contacting residents, contacting business owners, property owners, to basically carry out that mitigation, or it's carried out by the city on city-owned land, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I understood, because that's such a kind of astonishing number from 60, you've, reduced the exposure of the city so vastly.
If I could add really quickly, just to clarify, the other thing to keep in mind too is that 62% pays no mind to where the assets are located. So when we calculate this 0.47% exposure, we're also eliminating areas where we have no electrical assets. So, of course, if we have no electrical assets, there's no danger of us sparking a fire in those areas.
Okay.
So when we go from 62% to 0.47%, that also includes the removal or the discounting of areas where we have no electrical assets.
Like a parking lot with no light,
Absolutely.
an unlit parking lot.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
I do have one additional question. In terms of the public input, it sounds like we're having opportunities now to engage us here at the commission, at the next city council, whenever it's brought forward, and then post the adoption, it sounds like there will be public outreach and input opportunities. Is that correct?
Commissioner Carrasco, at this point, there are no specific plans in place, and I'm not saying that we won't be organizing any public meetings or anything like that, but at this point we don't have any plans, but we are always soliciting feedback, and as you mentioned, we will be presenting at City Council, which is another opportunity to get feedback. We'll also be updating our website with specific information related to the wildfire mitigation plan, and of course folks can submit their feedback through the website as well.
Okay, just based on the slide here, it says we're going to submit it on December 3rd, and then following that, there would be public outreach and education. So I was just trying to get clarity around.
If I can interject, that's mainly when we take the completed plan and make sure we get it out to as many people as possible so they're aware of it. And then if they have questions, if they live in an area that happens to be one of the areas that they'll contact us. But, just following up on what Darrell said, and I think Commissioner Law was going there too, is, kudos to the fire department. They've been doing this for as long as I've been here. They are very aggressive. And they, in turn, have inspired us, because I can't tell you how much investment we make every year in not only brush control, but palm fronds. I mean, we attack palm trees. Not literally. We do it very nicely and horticulturally correct, but we are very aggressive in cutting and trimming those trees and making sure we don't have stray fronds, because that, besides our friends, squirrels, birds, and mylar balloons, is one of the biggest issues. And that is really exacerbated in the wind. So the investment we've been making over the last several years is substantial. So, the joint efforts have been very, very successful in getting us to a position where we are, we're not perfect, and we haven't completely eliminated any potential danger, but I think in comparison to others, we're doing very, very well. And Darrell had that list, as you saw, of a number of other things that we're going to go after and implement as part of our infrastructure upgrades. I do also want to add, though, this is Glendale's plan. But it is critical for us as a utility that everybody else is doing this as well, because we were extremely fortunate and have been to date that we haven't had a major fire here in Glendale. But that doesn't mean that our electrical system has gone unscathed. On 10/10, October 10th, from the fire in the valley, the Saddle Ridge Fire, I believe it was called, we had lost 2/3 of our transmission and we were in an N1-1. You folks may remember me referring to that during the Grayson repowering. A lot of people said that's something that will never happen. We were there. We were there. And thank God it was cool. That was the only saving grace, is that the weather was down. It wasn't even as hot as projected. It dropped our load projections for the day, which really helped us, because at Grayson, in addition to losing the transmission, we were having a hard time keeping Grayson going. We had several breakdowns. Again, luck. And that's not the way to run a utility, believe me, folks, is on luck. But one would break down, and we would bring it up just as another one broke down. And so we were able to keep the cycle going long enough till 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. before Los Angeles re-energized the transmission lines. So we are very, very vulnerable to others outside of our control to keep our energy on. And as Daryl said, the last thing we would ever want to do is de-energize. And we've got a lot of things going for us that would make that a last resort. But others may de-energize, and that could have a great impact on us. So,
Thank you. Madam Secretary, is there any oral communication?
6, oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Commission may question or respond to the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. The general manager may refer the matter to the appropriate staff for investigation and report. I don't have any.
Okay. What about forecast? Next item?
So we have the end of the year, the end of the calendar year there, 1 month of December, and then we're going to regroup and bring you back a 12-month calendar starting on our January meeting. I believe, though, January we have a cancellation. Is that what we're predicting?
January 6th is the Armenian holiday.
Okay. So we tentatively will cancel the January meeting. However, depending on what the schedule is, we may have a special meeting later in the month or just roll to February. But we'll put together a new calendar for the coming year. So before the end of the year, we have these 3 items that we had indicated. When we come back in the new year, I know we had some updates that we're going to be providing you on a couple of different things that we talked about during the course of the year. So we'll have those on the new calendar, but this is what we have now to finish up the calendar year.
So, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, we're going to add the election of the president and secretary to our upcoming meeting in December. Something that's just I'm curious about is our water infrastructure and how prepared our water infrastructure is in case of a seismic event. I guess I've just been thinking about earthquakes. So I don't know if that is something that would be addressed as part of an existing update in the next 6 to 12 months? Or?
We do give you a capital update. We try to give you at least one a year for both the electric and water side, and we can easily roll it into that. The new buzzword for that is resiliency.
Yes.
So the whole issue of building resiliency into your infrastructure, water comes to mind. Questions to Daryl about undergrounding and how seismic activity affects that. Generally, as Daryl said, we haven't found a lot of problems in the electric side. In the water side, you can run into more difficult problems, and so there's been some advances, and our neighbors next door in LA have been trying some. I hate to use the term flexible pipe, but more flexible pipe, less rigid, whatever you want to call it. And so we've been looking at that as well. There's a couple of places in California. UC Davis, I believe, has been testing. The pipe is primarily Japanese-made pipe, and they've been using it in Japan for quite some time because they have a lot of seismic issues, volcanic issues, liquefaction issues. So that's come over and gone through some extensive testing at UC Davis, and LA is putting it into place. And so I've been talking with Mr. DeGhetto briefly of how we might be able to look at the future for of that type of infrastructure for us. So we'll definitely roll it into our infrastructure.
That would be great.
Update.
That really interests me. Thank you.
I have another topic I'd like to look in putting into the calendar, just a Shoal Canyon update.
Sure.
I don't have a specific month, but sometime coming.
The EIR for the Shoal Canyon project will likely, we're hoping it gets to us as staff by the end of the year, so it's being wrapped up by the consultant, and then it will go through internal, operational, legal, and outside legal review. So sometime next spring is probably when it'll be ready for release to the public. That might be a good time to come and give you an update.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, if there is no other any suggestion, next item?
8, adjournment.
Yeah. Yeah,
I move.
adjourn.
A second.